Anyway, I've got some slides. So me, I'm not a missionary. I've done some quite a number of short-term, brief mission trips, mainly as an educator and as a counsellor. So as you heard, I'm an educator, I'm a counsellor, I've been an academic for quite a few years. One of the problems with being an academic is they make you do a PhD, which wasn't something actually in my plan of life at my age. And when I pondered what I would do, I thought about the fields that I'd been on and the significant trauma that I saw, not just in the local people, but also in the missionaries who were serving those local people. And I guess I've had my own experiences that were pretty scary too, being in Sri Lanka in the war. So just that little bit of a sense myself of wondering, how do missionaries do this day in and day out? How do they manage ongoing situations of trauma? How do they manage ongoing situations where they're faced with really big things every day? And what impact does that have on their mental health? So how does it influence them? But then my further thinking was, do people actually leave the mission field because they can't cope anymore? Do they actually leave because the cumulative effects of the things that they've experienced are just too much for them? And either their physical health or their mental health breaks down and they go home. So that started my, I guess, prayerful thinking about, if I have to do a PhD, I might as well do something that might actually be helpful for somebody. I did ask people around me in my place of work what they did for their PhDs, and one gentleman shared with me that he did his in an obscure 14th century English poet, and I thought, well, that changed the world, didn't it? So I really wanted to do something that I thought might really help people. So I've only worked in Southeast Asia, so it's very appropriate that I think I'm in this conference today, and in a number of different countries in Southeast Asia and the subcontinent. And these are just a few little pictures I picked out of my big scrapbook of pictures. So the study that I did was, I guess I've sort of said that, looking at, do missionaries actually leave the field because of the traumatic experiences? And then what kind of traumatic experiences do they actually have too? What sorts of things do happen to missionaries? And do those experiences impact the way they actually do life, and then eventually bring them home as well? I was also interested to find out whether, given all of the things that people go through on the field, were there some things that actually helped them to stay? So part of my research was, well, what helped you? What were the sorts of things that kept you on the field as well? Because I thought that might be helpful for people to know. So this whole session today is actually sharing some of my literature review, which gives a lot of background to the experiences that other people have written about of trauma. When you're doing a PhD, you have to find a gap in the literature, and my gap was that there's very little written about people's experience of trauma on the mission field. There's some kind of, I guess, lists that you can tick a box on saying, I had a traumatic experience and I went home, but there's actually nothing out in the literature that interviewed people for their lived experiences. And so that's what I decided to do, was to interview my participants. So just a little bit more background here. I think some of this is pretty mind-boggling. 2019, 400, nearly 500,000 missionaries on the field. I'm sure some of that's changed since COVID, because so many people have had to actually exit and go home. So that won't be quite accurate now. But the conservative cost of putting a missionary on the field is said to be around $40,000 US. So that's a huge impost on those who send missionaries as well. The next one is a bit sobering. A mission organisation retains 45% of its missionaries on the field over a 10-year period, but it loses 46%. And then there's a differentiation there of the very large mission organisations that tend to be able to retain their missionaries, but the very small ones have a large attrition rate. And just my reading put that down to just the resources that the larger organisations have in order to sustain people on the field. And I guess we know, we're looking at Afghanistan right now, so many people have been killed for their faith across the world right now. So those of you who are on the field, and I presume many of you will be, you know that mission field is now in war-torn countries. We know there's a lot more political unrest that it wasn't like that 40 years ago. We know there's persecution and torture. We know, I'm working in Myanmar, for instance, and the junta and the sorts of things that are happening there are just quite even traumatic for me, working with people, listening to what's happening. So we also have, on top of that, what lots of people have referred to in the last 24 hours in this conference have been the natural disasters as well. And what we're actually seeing is that a lot of missionaries are working in the role of first responders, and they're working alongside of aid workers doing that kind of work. However, aid workers and first responders are often trained to do the work, but missionaries have a different focus, which is a gospel focus. So what the evidence is that they're not trained to do the work of aid work and first responders in natural disasters. I've been really excited to hear a number of the speakers who are saying that over the last day, that that's the work that people are doing. So I think it's quite sobering to think that a missionary's life is likened to be like that of a soldier in combat, encountering crises such as disasters, war, rape, robbery, severe illness, which are all experienced by soldiers. We're looking at the impact of war on soldiers in America that have served in numbers of deployments, and it wouldn't be hard to imagine that that's true for missionaries as well. So we talk about social and cultural isolation, geographical isolation, and also very complex organisational roles of command and how things actually work out when there is a disaster. This verse has been quoted I don't know how many times in the last 24 hours, mostly from Isaiah, but I've chosen the Luke one. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. So Engel and Dryness said there's a bold mandate to combine faith with action to overcome injustice and oppression. So it's not unreasonable to hypothesise that some missionaries encountering such situations may experience trauma responses. And we're going to talk about what trauma responses look like. So Erickson in 1997, which is a few years ago now, proposed that around 10% of all returning missionaries could be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I would imagine it's more than that these days, given the juntas in countries, the war-torn countries that people are dealing with, given to COVID as well, and all of the trauma around dealing with COVID. I would imagine there's a lot more PTSD than Erickson proposed. So my study itself, I had some limitations to it because I'm in Australia. They wouldn't let me travel, which is what I wanted to be able to do. So I had to actually contain it to Australian missionaries who could speak English, who'd been on the field for more than 2 years. All but one of my respondents were, most of them had been on the field for some of them 30, 40 years. So they were quite older. They went when they were young and they were there for many, many years and had to come back. So that we're talking about people where this is their whole life on the field. There was only one young couple that had been there for just 2 years. The rest had been there for a number of years longer. And again, the ages between 25 and 75. So they also had to have returned in the last 5 years. And that's partly so that their memories were fresh. So they weren't recounting things that had happened 30 years ago as well. I won't go into all of this, but those of you who might be researchers might be interested in the methodology, and I'll just flip it there for a bit of a second. So what I really did was actually interview in a semi-structured, pre-prepared interview. So I had a semi-structured, but because I'm a counsellor, I can make up stuff as I go and ask the questions that I needed to ask. So that kind of made it fairly easy to do the interviews. In retrospect, I'd probably do them differently now, but it's done, what's done. I've found people through my own networks too. When I started to talk about it, people said, oh, I know somebody. And since then, I think I don't know how many people have actually said, oh, I know somebody that would have been really great for your research. So maybe there's room for more at some stage later on too. So, okay, so let's just talk about trauma for a minute. I've heard a lot of conversation today in the workshops and in the plenaries this morning around mental health issues and the presentation of mental health in missionaries. But I want to take that to another step lower than just saying somebody has anxiety, somebody's depressed. Because what I'm proposing is that a lot of the mental health issues that we're seeing presented are actually as a result of trauma, of the trauma that people have experienced. So we're going to have just a quick little look here at what trauma actually is from some of the, I guess, the writers over the years who've written so much about trauma. So we're talking about when something happens where somebody's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is so overwhelmed that they feel like they're going to die. Okay, and they can't move from that. We're talking about an event that's so extremely traumatic that it's upsetting and it overwhelms the individual's internal resources and it produces lasting psychological symptoms. So you don't just get over them in a couple of weeks' time, they continue to be reproduced. And we know about trauma, the way the symptoms of trauma are reproduced often are in our bodies. So we have trigger points where we act and react in particular ways that tell us that we're unsafe. Neurobiology has contributed a huge amount to this area of trauma and understanding how our bodies actually react when we feel we're under threat. God has made our bodies in an amazing way so that we most of you will have heard of fight and flight. So when we're under threat, we pump adrenaline and cortisol, for instance, to be able to react to keep ourselves safe. So the issue with when we've had repeated traumas or even just one trauma is that our bodies are in a constant cycle, constantly cycling adrenaline and cortisol, telling us that we're unsafe. And when that's happening all of the time, we either our physical bodies start to break down or our mental states start to break down because we're in a constant state of fight or flight, or sometimes people just go into freeze. Freeze is, I guess, likened to a woman who's been raped. And when that goes to court, they will say, oh, well, she didn't fight back, so she must have been complicit in it. Well, you don't fight back, you actually freeze or you feign, so you actually don't have any reaction at all. That's also a trauma response. So the common denominator in trauma is the feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat annihilation. So if you take that back to thinking about a panic attack, so we might diagnose somebody as having panic attacks, but if you actually link that back to the loss of control and threat of annihilation because of the traumatic event, it would be pretty normal to think that somebody might be having a panic attack when they actually go back into a similar sort of circumstance. Or just even hearing a noise that reminds them of something that was really terrifying. The one that really reminds people is actually smell. So we use our 5 senses, but it's actually smell, the olfactory system, that reacts the most glaringly to help us, to trigger us into a trauma reaction. So Rothschild, who was one of the masters in trauma research, said psychological trauma is a response of the mind and the nervous system to an experience that is so overwhelmingly frightening and life-threatening that it cannot come to terms with it. So I'm not going to read this, but these are some of the things that come up for people as a trauma response. Okay, these are some of the feelings. These are some of the things that we're dealing with when somebody is broken by a traumatic experience. And if you look through that and just think this list through, and some of the things that you're reading there, and thinking about how do we actually help somebody in these sorts of areas. Know that cynicism is one of them. And cynicism is one of those things that eventually means that people leave the field too. And it's really quite, and one of the research that I read said that cynicism, people get really disillusioned as a trauma response, but what they do is actually blame the organisation. So some of you might be even familiar with that, but it actually comes out of the cynicism that comes from the trauma response, and then you're looking for someone to blame, and the organisation or the leaders are the people that blame, which causes all sorts of organisational problems, of course, too. So a trauma response, then looking at even just DSM-5 diagnosis here, we're looking at mental health issues now. Okay, so you might not be necessarily, you might be working with people who are really depressed. So we can treat the depression, but actually what we need to be doing is treating the trauma. Okay, we need to be looking at the trauma. And so we could be treating sleep disorders, people not sleeping, and there's not sleeping because they're hearing things and seeing things, and they're having nightmares all of the time. So we can try and actually do sleep hygiene with them, but it actually won't solve the problem because the nightmares are going to keep recycling because the trauma response is actually activated. Somatic disorders are body disorders. That's when we have pain in our bodies and things happening medically and physically that can't be attached to, say, an injury or a genetic issue or something like that. Means that our bodies are actually breaking down because of the health stress. Now, some of the things I really looked at in this research were maybe 3 other things other than just trauma. So one is vicarious trauma, which I think missionaries must experience quite a lot. So Rothschild again defines it as bearing witness to another's traumatic experience, or their trauma narrative elicits symptoms of trauma in the listener. Now, I could say that counsellors are people who experience vicarious trauma. So if you go into an earthquake site a month after the earthquake, and you're debriefing people that's been their lived experience, I can tell you by the end of 2 days, you will be experiencing vicarious trauma yourself because you're hearing the narratives over and over again, and you're beginning to feel those experiences in your own body, in your own mind. You will have sleepless nights because you'll be picturing the sorts of things that people, I'm very visual, so I picture what people have been through when they're telling me their stories. I can actually see it. So vicarious trauma means that you're on the loop of retelling those stories to yourself, but they're somebody else's. So you might not have actually witnessed it yourself or been through it yourself, but it will keep reoccurring to you in other things like PTSD and panic attacks. Or I think people, self-care for counsellors, particularly people like me who work with fairly intense trauma, If we don't do a lot of self-care and are not aware of this, depression could be really easy. You just fall into the slump. There's a lot of questions to be asked about the world when you're listening to other people's trauma all of the time. And then we have cumulative trauma, and I think cumulative trauma is something that I've not heard mentioned at all in the last day, but I actually think it's really important. So what I've learnt from my respondents to my research and all of my reading is that missionaries don't just have a traumatic experience. They just have one after another, after another, after another, and sometimes they've got 3 or 4 all running at the same time. So one of my participants, trying to not identify too much, in a country that had an earthquake, husband was doing the BBC reports because his English was really good to be able to do that, so he could actually translate really well. The family was left back home with constant rumbles and earthquakes going around all of the time. At the week after that, when the husband had just come home, their 12-year-old who just convinced them that it was actually safe to have a push bike and ride that to school, got hit by a motorbike and had almost his ankle amputated by the motorbike. And it had to have so many surgeries in the country that they actually had to come back to Australia in order to have it treated properly because it got so infected. So you've got, that's just one of their stories. The husband was going on a trek up the mountains and everybody else was short, but he hit his head on overhead rock and got concussed from that. And they had 10 things in the space of 3 months. So it was just enormous, the sorts of things, the cumulative trauma. Now, this gentleman started to have panic attacks, and every time he got in his vehicle to leave the actual city itself, he had a panic attack and he was immobilised. So this was one of the stories of one of my participants and how huge it was. So that was cumulative trauma. One thing at a time they probably could have managed, but so many things happening concurrently was too much for this, particularly for this gentleman. And for him, a really sad ending, because they came back to Australia and he's lost his faith. He couldn't find God in it anywhere. He doesn't go to church anymore. He couldn't understand how God would let this happen when they really believed that God had called them to the mission field. They loved the country they were serving in. They loved the work. And he's lost God. So there's pretty serious consequences when we think about how we process these things. So one of the things that's really important when we're looking at how to help somebody who's had a lot of trauma is that we need to look at the whole history of trauma, not just a single event. And I'm talking about the whole history. It's not just the history of what might have happened on the field, but you know what? There's lots of caring people out there who are on the field that have had horrific traumatic childhoods as well. It's one of the things that calls them into ministry. They want to be healers for the broken because they were broken and God's healed them. But when you've actually got your own childhood trauma history, it complicates it even more. And this is one of the reasons why people who are working in this field really need to have looked at their own trauma and need to have done some work around their own healing in order to be able to help others. We cannot help others from an empty vessel. So the other thing, and I know that's been mentioned today by other speakers, but loss and grief is massive, as some of you will know, on the mission field. And when I started to look at the sorts of things that that people lost when they went on the field, it was almost insurmountable. And I think the call from God, the surety of the call from God, helped people overlook the actual losses. But I can remember working with some people in people in another country where the children had been relocated 9 times. And they had really big behaviour issues. And I think they were only like 9 and 12. And I'm thinking, if you've been relocated and lost your friends 9 times in 5 years, you're going to be fairly unstable. So that was one of my first big ahas of going, oh, wow, this is huge. This really has huge throwback on, particularly on the children. So we also need to look at loss and grief in the context of trauma as well. And then just basically we talk about stress and burnout. People leave because of burnout anyway. But stress comes from a multiple of factors that we're looking at here. And the cumulative stress and the cumulative facing the traumatic experience will lead to burnout for some people, where people just hit the wall. Now, when we're talking about burnout, you don't just go to bed for a week. Real burnout means that you just can't get out of bed for a year, that you just cannot keep going, that there's just nothing that can motivate you. Your whole body goes into collapse. It's not a good place to be. I've worked with people who have hit the wall, and it's something that is long-haul recovery. And I'm not sure that people ever totally recover from it. So can you see that we've actually got a whole mix of things happening here now with cumulative trauma, stress, loss and grief? You put that all into a package, and then we're looking at people who may be depressed, may be anxious, may be having all sorts of mental health issues. So we're not just treating what the outward form of that is, we're actually treating where it began and looking at the whole of people's stories. And I've listened to people today talk about story and storytelling, in particularly in Asia, is such a part of the whole, I guess, Asian way of communications here in our Indigenous people in Australia as well. Storytelling and narrative therapy is one of the healing ways of allowing people to tell their stories. But we have to recognise the story needs to be told, and it's the whole story, not just a little bit. I guess just my caveat on that, though, telling the whole story all in one go will actually re-traumatise people as well. So we actually don't let somebody tell a big, long story for 2 hours about all the terrible things that have happened to them, because at the end of that, they won't be doing so well. So we're actually helping people tell story, but in smaller increments, and just listening deeply into the story. Of course, I use a lot of expressive therapies, so I use play, I use symbols and sand trays, and I use a lot of art in my work, and that helps people still tell stories that resolves the pain without actually having to do the talking, which might re-traumatise them as well. So just a little bit there about the sorts of things we see when somebody's quite stressed and burnt out. I can remember doing a stress and burnout seminar for teachers who were just about to graduate from university, and I put a whole lot of this up on the wall, and I went, oh my goodness, I think that's me. I might have to do something about this. So we need to recognise what the signs are before we actually hit the wall. One of the really big things that came up in my issue, and some of you will be, in my research, some of you will be familiar with this, is there's often a lot of conflict in teams on the field. And the people in my research who had experienced this described them as being traumatic. It wasn't what they expected. They thought on the field, working with a bunch of other Christians, that it would be quite nice and pleasant, and there would be a lot of love and humility, and people were there for the same aims. But that wasn't often what happened, particularly when they were in teams from lots of different cultures where there's lots of different ways of approaching the same situation, not the right or wrong, just different, which means that people would end up being against each other. And so when that happens, the whole of the team itself goes into fallout, and the goal of the mission gets put aside, and sometimes there's a lot of authority that comes in, and people submit to the authority, but it actually, just to avoid the conflict, but it doesn't resolve the problem at all. There's a great cost to the team. And then we have missionary children. I just want to throw this into the mix because I work with kids, so I'm very interested in the children. What we know is that MKs do really well on the field. They're amazing people. They've had rich experiences, the ones that I know well, multilingual, well-versed, ride motorbikes, do all sorts of stuff that kids in our little safe Brisbane can't do. They've been exposed to all sorts of incredible things, and they're amazing people. However, they often don't do well when they get back to their home country. They don't fit very well. They don't know how to do life. We know that third culture kids actually really struggle when they come back home. And they often go back to the mission field because they don't actually fit anywhere. They can't find where they fit. The other thing that's happening for them, though, and these are some of the stories, is that they're worrying about their parents all of the time. They're worried that their parents won't come home. They see terrible accidents. You know, I guess you all know that I'm in a really protected environment here in Brisbane, but overseas you see horrific things just as a normal accident, where they've seen blood and guts spilt out everywhere. You see guns everywhere, those sorts of things. They're actually quite traumatic for young people. The young people that I've been connected with have had huge experience of loss and death. So many people that have died and that they've seen die, and they've been witnesses to all sorts of terrible things. So there's a lot of trauma in the children as well. So one of the things I researched then was looking at mental health from a Christian perspective. And again, this has been mentioned today as well. There's so much stigma in the Christian community around mental health. So traditionally, when we go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was seen that psychology was at odds with mainstream Christian thinking, which still remains in fundamental religious organisations now. So one of the things that people, particularly who've been long-term on the field or who come from very fundamental organisations, is that they don't understand the psychological responses, and they are very suspicious of looking at them through a psychological lens. And this has been really counterproductive to people getting the help that they need. So there's this sense that if you're on the field, if you're a full-time worker, that you'll be really spiritually strong, that you'll be able to get through anything. And so upholding that makes life difficult for somebody to be able to admit that they're really doing it tough, that things aren't going well. And because they don't talk about it, they don't let people know that they're really struggling, and it builds up until they get to that end point where they actually have to, and then it's too late to get the help that they need. So we've talked today also about, I can't remember who it was now, but I love what he actually said, that it was, you know, we can look at it from a psychosocial, spiritual issue when we're talking about mental health. And sometimes it is demon possession, sometimes it is sin, sometimes it has spiritual roots. But if we actually attribute every mental health issue to sin in somebody's life, we've missed it. If we attribute every single piece of depression to demonic activity, we've missed it. And so one of the things that the Christian community has to actually move past is attributing everything to a spiritual root. Okay? Trauma, having your child with his foot nearly ripped off by a motorbike isn't a sin. Okay? It's a trauma. We need to deal with that differently. So I think I feel pretty strongly about that, sorry. So the stigma then, some of the research though did say that prayer is seen to be more effective than psychological help. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm sure many of you have had a lot of experience of knowing that prayer changes things, but we also know it doesn't always. And I think that's where we need to be careful. There are people who believe that the scriptures are seen to be sufficient for all issues in life. At a basic level, somebody said that today too. but they actually do not address specific things, like the boy with his foot nearly ripped off. Okay? People are more likely to turn to friends for help rather than a professional or a medication. And this has come out today as well. I feel really privileged that I'm doing the last one today because everybody's built up to what I've got to say. People have been saying these things all day. So, and this is where lay people come into really full force, is that you're more likely to talk to a friend when you're struggling than ring a counsellor. So this is where we need to equip lay people. We need everybody to be equipped in basic ways to help people when they're struggling. People get really caught up in actually admitting that they're really struggling because it might seem like they really don't have a good relationship with Jesus and they'll feel judged. So, which means they don't ask for help. The problem's spiritualised. And what we know, there's a new terminology around called spiritual bypassing, which I'm just going to briefly look at here. It describes the tendency to use spiritual explanations to avoid complex psychological issues. It prevents people from acknowledging what they are feeling and distances them from both themselves and others. It may help in the short term, but it does not solve the problems in the long term. And there's some things there where we avoid our feelings, when we pretend we don't have them, when we are really very optimistic and speak positive over everything. And I totally believe in positive psychology and positivity and looking at our blessings. But when we do that and discount the fact that we're seething with anger on the inside, it actually leads to psychological issues. So, and I think pretending that things are fine when things clearly are not fine. And we pretend to ourselves, not just to everybody else. So there's some protective factors as well. Okay, this is part of my research. Social supports are really, really important for people who've been through a lot of trauma. Your personal spiritual practices, like prayer and meditation, Bible reading also. One of the things my research showed is that parental warmth and support from a family system back home is a protective factor. I interviewed people whose families were so angry about them being on the field that it was unhelpful. But those who had families that prayed for them, mums who would say what was happening at 2 a.m. on Friday, God woke me up in the middle of the night to pray for you. What was happening was one of those amazing things where people feel like they're really being supported and loved by their family. They're not there on the field on their own. So people who have got intelligent problem-solving abilities, it's a protective factor. People who are optimistic rather than pessimistic. People who've got social skills, because being on the field requires that you actually have to work with people all the time. So social skills are really helpful. And people are resilient. And as I said to somebody just this morning who was really struggling, I said, you know, the stuff that you learned in the cauldron of really hard stuff means that you're resilient now. So we've got to be careful with that, though, because sometimes the cauldron burns us up too. This has also come up today too, and I did a lot of research into this, and it certainly came out with my participants, is that we actually need to do a lot of work to have instilled in ourselves a theology of suffering. And it's really, really important. I train counsellors, and we're listening to the most horrific stories all of the time. And if we cannot find where God is in that suffering, we lose hope. So we actually have to work out ourselves. It's a personal journey, I believe we have to go on to work out where God is in the suffering. And my personal view is if we believe God caused the suffering, we're going to get stuck. The last time I was in Asia, I had the opportunity to preach a number of times, and I preached that God is a good God everywhere I went. And that's been my personal story, my personal testimony coming out of trying to work out where God is in the mess. So it was really, really important to me. So I really want to emphasize that. So finding God in the middle of it, in the middle of God's transcendent power. We're hearing stories come out of Afghanistan now of God rescuing, God doing things. So thank you, Arjun. Is that you?
Yes,
Thank
Julie.
you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. All right, let me close the session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation on trauma and missionaries, a very enriching session. And I'm very sure that our participants have benefited from your session.